Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my LEC Spring Split Week 2 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Feels kind of good to get back into some weekly review stuff. We haven't really done that the past few days, of course, if you haven't been around the channel. In the past few days, we've been doing my LCK and LCS playoff primer videos. A link to those are going to be up in the iCard right now. You can go ahead and check those out if you are interested in kind of getting a nice rundown of not only my awards for what I think happened in the regular season in both of those regions, but also what I think is going to be happening to those teams in the playoffs. If you want to check those videos out, you can go click on them up in the iCard. But in this video, we're going to be talking about the LEC, and of course, with the shortened regular season, quote-unquote, with only being 3 weeks and every week being a super week, all of these games are ridiculously important. So I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time. I want to jump right into the analysis and right into the action. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of Week 2 here in the LEC. What teams surprised you, what teams didn't. Obviously, we're going to be going over it, but this was a pretty wild and crazy week in the LEC. There really isn't a lot to hang your hat on in terms of definites right now, and I think that makes the split in Europe so much more fun. So let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with day number 1. We're going to be going through all 3 days, of course, on this video. Going through all 15 games, talking about player of the game, dud of the game, all that fun stuff. And then at the end, I'll be doing my power rankings. But kicking off day 1, we had a fun matchup between Mad Lions and Astralis. And Mad is able to pick up the win here, which was super important for them. Astralis actually started off the season in a really good form. They went 2-1 the previous week. They were picking up wins against teams they absolutely shouldn't, like G2, which not a lot of people saw coming, but you had to figure that the wheels were going to fall off, at least kind of. They're not a bad team by any means. Clearly, the addition of Leader in the mid lane is an upgrade to Dior, and obviously Kabe and Jonghoon have been really good. I think 113 and Finn have gotten a little bit better. Astralis isn't a pushover, but Mad Lions is one of those teams that really disappointed in week 1, and you had to expect was going to be able to bounce back here in week number 2, and they absolutely did. A really good win, a really solid win from them that they honestly just dominated basically from moment 1. Even some of the lanes that they were supposed to lose, they just kind of won. My player of the game here is going to go to Hylissang in the support position. Obviously, Hilly on Engagers is just a different animal. The past few metas just really haven't been all that great for him in terms of his personal playstyle. Enchanters are just not what you want to see Hylissang on. I know he likes to play the flash-in aggressive Lulu style, but I'd much rather see that on Rel than on Lulu, and that's kind of what we got in this game. Carzzy and Hilly did not jump out to a particularly strong start in week 1. In my opinion, they were probably the biggest reason why this team really struggled in that first week of the season. It's really good to see them bounce back. Play something like Xayah Rel. Yes, it's in the Kaiser Rakan, which Xayah Rel should absolutely obliterate, but, at the very least, they were able to actually capitalize on that. We'll talk about a matchup on Astralis' side in a bit that they really should have won, and they didn't win it. And so, just because you're given a winning matchup doesn't mean you're automatically going to actually be able to win it. It's good to see Hilly kind of bounce back. And Carzzy in that same vein, he had to capitalize on a lot of the plays that Hilly was actually making in this game, and I thought he did a really good job doing that on the Xayah. Xayah is one of those picks that I think is very quickly becoming just the best AD carry in the meta. I think she basically gives you everything that you want out of that position, and obviously when Hilly and Carzzy are allowed to play a little bit more aggressively, I think that's always going to be a plus for those two in particular in the bottom lane. But outside of that, Elyoya was spectacular on the Wukong, being able to generate a really strong lead early in the jungle matchup, basically making the Lee Sin completely irrelevant by 5 to 10 minutes into the game, and then using a lot of that pressure to be able to influence lanes, mostly bot lane in this instance, because the combo initiation of Rel ultimate into Wukong knockup is just very difficult to actually deal with. I mean, you're adding on a Gnar, potentially even like a Gragas. You've got a lot of ways to keep the enemy team from actually playing the game, and Elyoya and Hilly being like on the same page and really being active and aggro in this game, I think was a really big plus for Mab. Niski picking up Gragas, it's his signature pick. Obviously, he's been able to play it a ridiculous amount over the course of the year so far, with Gragas mid being back, I would say. And that's just really good into melee mids. That's kind of the melee mid counter in the meta right now. And so for Leader, that's a little bit of a problem, because that's really his bread and butter. So it's a really good pick for Niski to bring out the Gragas. And then Chasey kind of locking himself in a pick that's supposed to lose, but he just dominated the top lane matchup anyway, so it didn't really matter. Mad Lions basically taking advantage of everything that they could in this one. Really good showing from them. As for Astralis on the other side, not a good one. Yes, he had a good week 1, but you got to be able to keep it up. That's always going to be an issue, and, I was worried about the talent on this team going into the year. I'm not saying that I'm fully pulling the plug. The team's only 2-2 right now, but this is the kind of team I expected going into to the split, if I'm being entirely honest. Was a team that wasn't going to be able to keep pace with talented teams like Mad Lions. Leader kind of got a little exposed in this one. He didn't actually play all that bad. He was just kind of useless, right? On the Akali, there's nobody on the enemy team to actually assassinate. Maybe the Xayah, but even then she can just ult, or you have a ton of peel on this team with the Wukong, with the Gragas. You have a ton of ways to keep people off of your AD carry, so Akali's not going to be particularly useful, and she can't really do anything in lane against the Gragas. 113 got obliterated early on the Lee Sin. He was useless by the time we rolled around to mid-game. Kabe and Jonghoon's scorelines look utterly horrible. Kabe, I'm going to give a little bit of a pass. There's only so much that you can do on the Kai'Sa. Yes, he was a little bit too far forward, and I think the scoreline is definitely the worst in the game, but I certainly don't think he was the player who played the worst. I think he was just, unfortunately, the one who had to receive the worst circumstances. Jonghoon missed some point-blank Rakan Ws, but my dud of the game is going to go to Finn in the top lane. He gets his signature pick, the pick we all associate with Finn in the Kled top. He brings Ignite, he plays Kled into Gnar, and he loses early. He's down like 40 CS at 10 minutes. It's unacceptable. Like, that is just not possible. You have to be able to win this matchup, or else that champion is going to be completely useless. Yes, I know his scoreline really isn't all that bad, but I think when you take a grander look at the game, Finn was the biggest problem with Astralis in this one. And I think if he was actually able to be a little bit of a strong point on the map for them, this could have been a much easier game for them to actually play out. Unfortunately, him losing so hard was a massive issue. I think you could give dud of the game to Kabe, you could give it to 113, you could probably even give it to Jonghoon, but for me, Finn was the most notable because he was the one that they were kind of relying on to win in the early game, and once he lost, the game was basically doomed. I would say Astralis, I'm hoping that this is just a flash in the pan. I want Astralis to be good. I want them to be more of what they showed in week 1, but if I had to take a guess, I just don't think this team is top 6 worthy. They should be top 8. They should be able to, be better than some of the bottom teams in the league, but this could be a sign of things to come if this team continues to get outdrafted in the way they did in this game. As for Mad Lions, it's good to get back on track. You're now at 2-2 as well. If you can have a really good week here, you're going to be walking out of here feeling at least pretty confident. Even 500 would be pretty solid coming out of week 2. This is a team that historically ramps up over the course of the season. They're still finding their stride, I think. A little bit of a finals hangover, I would say, for Mad so far. But overall, I still really like this team, and I think that they're probably going to get underrated with how they played in week number 1. And then moving on to our second series of day 1 here, and it's a battle between two teams near the bottom of the standings right now. We had Team Heretics taking on Excel, and Heretics picking up their first win of the season. It was a brutal week number 1 for Heretics. Last week, they really couldn't get a lot going. Their solo laners in particular were massive hindrances to their team, even with their jungler playing at a pretty exceptional level through the first couple of games. Well, it finally paid some dividends. Their jungler continued to look fantastic. Jankos continues to prove that he is one of the best junglers in Europe. And Heretics is able to take this in 37 minutes. Now, I would have liked them to be able to close this out sooner, especially with the, I'll say, lack of cohesion on the side of Excel as a team in general, but at the very least, being able to pick up a win here is a good sign for this team's future. Player of the game is a no-brainer. It's got to go to the Heretics jungler. Jankos, he's legit like an all-pro candidate right now through 4 games, even though this team has only won 1. That's how good he has been playing. Of course, I'm not saying that everything around him is on fire no matter what, and he's the only worthwhile player on this roster. Players are allowed to have bad games every once in a while, and Jankos, I think, understands that. He was trying to deflect a lot of blame away from his teammates. I feel like piling on to Ruby and Evie and Jack and how they might have been struggling over the first couple of games is just not necessarily positive for Heretics' outlook as a whole, but it is good to praise that Jankos has definitely still got it. I mean, you can talk about one of the LEC GOATs, the greatest jungler in European League of Legends history, and it's really good to see him continue to perform at a high level, even on a team that may not be able to back him up in the same way that some of his previous teams did. It was a massive jungle gap this game, and really the best way I can describe it is it was cohesion versus not cohesion. Jankos had a lot of support, a lot of backup from his team, even if they weren't mechanically, always there in the right spot. I thought Jack and Mersa in particular were awesome this game. We'll get to them in a bit, but Jankos had a lot of backup. Xerxes did not. I mean, there were so many moments where Excel looked completely disfigured in terms of how they wanted to engage in a lot of situations where Xerxes would go all in with ultimate and nobody would be able to follow up, or everybody would be backing out, and then you see a VTO Yone ult come in. Excel was just very all over the place, and I think Jankos did a good job pulling Team Heretics together and kind of making them feel a little bit more jointed as a unit. And so really, really like how he played, and he is absolutely the heart and the soul of Heretics at this point. If they are going to win more games than people give them credit for, it is likely going to be through this jungle. Jack and Mersa, though, played really well this game. I know we can talk about how the solo laners haven't exactly been great this split. I think that really just puts a bigger target on Jack and Mersa in order to step up. I think Mersa has been unfairly targeted over the course of this split, or this year so far. I think that he actually played pretty well in winter. Really didn't have a lot of mistakes. I think Jack's positioning was a big problem with that bot lane, but Mersa is still really aggressive. He's still going to look to make plays, and he's still going to be moving around the map with his jungler. I think that's a big positive. Rakan's going to be a big pick for this team. And then Jack just needs something that he can play passive on so he can get to the late game. He's a very good team fighter, and he can play within structure rather well. But the problem is when he's kind of tested by other, teams, when they're, maybe Excel puts a lot of pressure in the bot lane. They didn't in this game, but, maybe the opponent puts a lot of pressure in the bot lane. Jack can sometimes crumble under that. I think if you can take some of the weight, some of the pressure off of Jack, just kind of let him be this late game AD carry that can clean up a lot of fights, let Jankos, Mersa kind of make a lot of the plays around the map, hopefully get either Evie or Ruby onto a strong side. I think that this team could look a lot better, and I think this was a good example of that. Jack just kind of got the ability to team fight in the late half of the game, and it really did help out a lot. I think Jankos improving is going to be great for that. I think Mersa improving is going to be great for that. Hopefully you can get more out of the solo laners. Heretics honestly doesn't look completely lost. They still don't look completely solved to me, but this was a rather decent look for a team that did not win a game in week number 1. And then for Excel, like I said, just disjointed. There's really no other word to talk about. My dud of the game is going to go to Xerxes. I think the jungle difference was the biggest in this game. That was the most noticeable. Odo was okay on the Cassante. I think some people are going to want to give it to Limit, but I actually don't think it was really his fault that he died as much as he did on the Nautilus. Very similar to Kabe in the last game. I think his scoreline is maybe a little bit worse than maybe how he played. Some of those initiations were fine, and a lot of them were peeling for Patrick, which I totally understand, but Xerxes, VTO, they just don't really seem to have any sort of chemistry together, and we've been saying that since last split. I think a lot of people were hoping that Limit coming in was going to fix a lot of the macro, a lot of the cohesion problems that Excel had over the course of this split, but Xerxes and VTO are just not clicking as a duo. They never really seem to be on the same page. I already talked about Xerxes going in and everyone backing out, or everyone backing out clearly, and then VTO just kind of using Yone ult, going in and immediately dying. Like, it just doesn't feel like there is a clear voice on this team. That's what, Limit was supposed to help, I think, but asking that of a new player who's trying to integrate himself into a dynamic that already existed, it's just a lot. I'm not surprised to see Excel struggling out of the gate. I do think that this loss is definitely worse than maybe they should be willing to take, right? Losing some of their games in week number 1, it was a little excusable. They lost to some good teams. They were able to pick up a win. They already looked a little bit better than they did in winter split, but this does raise some question marks. Hopefully this is just a bump in the road. Hopefully they can start figuring stuff out, but I think if things don't start to get better, if this team continues to be bottom 3 in the league, either the jungle or the mid just simply has to get changed. There really is no other choice. As for Heretics, hopefully this is the sign of things to come. This team is talented-ish on paper. Jankos is awesome. Evie's had some good moments, and I like Mersa a lot as a player. If you can get your young, unproven carry roles to step up, I think that's going to be massive for this team. I'm not exactly projecting that for them. I still think that this win might be a little bit more of an outlier, but at the very least, not being, winless through the first 4 games is a good step in the right direction. Then moving on to our third series, or third game of day number 1 here. It's a battle between a team that's been doing pretty well and a team that has very much not been doing all that well. We had Fnatic taking on Team BDS, and as expected, BDS is able to pick up the win here, as they should be able to do. This team has looked pretty legit over the course of the first couple of games. Obviously, they surpassed all expectations last split, and it felt like it was pretty sustainable. A lot of these players made massive leaps. A lot of the players I was really looking forward to seeing play at this level really did look good, and I think a lot of it is sustainable. I think that's what we've learned, is that these players, you can call their picks unorthodox, you can call their strategies not normal, but whatever works, whatever gets you that win is what you should be going for, and BDS has been getting a lot of wins over the past year so far. And then for Fnatic on the other side, they've just got some major issues to work out. There are a couple players on this team that have just not been able to step up to the plate this year so far. We'll talk about that in a bit. Of course, we'll start with BDS. We always start with the winning side in these videos, and player of the game, which was actually a little bit of a difficult decision in this one. 2 players absolutely deserved it. It's the 2 bot lane members. How could it be anything else? I think Broadcast gave it to Crownie for the Deathless game, but I think that Blitzcrank was just simply too important to not point out. So LeBron for me is going to be getting my player of the game for BDS. I think it's totally reasonable to give it to either, but that level 1 was utterly disastrous for the side of Fnatic. It basically ended the game for them right then and there. And a lot of that was Labrav. If Blitzcrank doesn't land that hook on Lux, and if you don't get that kill basically instantaneously, then I think you actually have to play into Caitlyn Lux, which all of a sudden becomes a much more difficult proposition for Jinx and Blitzcrank. But overall, BDS was able to establish their dominance in the bot lane early. They were able to spread the power around the map. The Blitzcrank was on the move. The Jinx and the Blitz end up getting first tower at like 10 minutes. And then Jinx is unkillable at that point. She's a late game hyper carry for a reason. If she's able to win in the early game and get super far ahead of an opposing Caitlyn of all things, like that game is just utterly doomed on the side of Caitlyn. And that's kind of what happened here. So you could give it to Crownie, but I'm going to give it to Labrav. The Blitzcrank was just huge, and I think Labrav in general has kind of been underrated by LEC fans across the year so far. I've been hearing a lot of people praise Crownie, rightfully so. He was in my All-Pro teams, but this bot lane would not be nearly as good if Labrav wasn't in it as well. I know he didn't have a great year in 2022 for Vitality when everything was kind of going wrong for that team, especially in the bot lane, but look at his career before that. This was a Rookie of the Year. This was somebody who had played with Crownie before and really looked like the core of Vitality. There was a reason that when that team went full super team mode, bringing in Perks and Alfari and Karzi and, you know, no jungle, self-made at the time, right? But ending up being Haru. Like, there was a reason Labrav was the only member of that Vitality team to be retained, and it's because he was he was thought of as a top 3 or 4 support in the region before last year. I think he is very quickly climbing back up to be right into that conversation again, and it's been really, really fun to watch. But Crownie's been a great benefactor of it. I think these two play off of each other incredibly well. It's just good to see both of these players who at one point in time were both looked at as kind of the future of their positions in the LEC kind of get another shot here on a team that a lot of people didn't have expectations for in BDS and really just prove everyone wrong. They've been a top 3 at probably worst bot lane in the LEC so far in 2023, and that's a lot of fun to watch. Other players on this team were good. Sheo impacted the map really well. I thought he did a good job enabling the Jinx and the Blitz in order to be safe. Nuke and Adam were solid. I really like the fact that this team can flex the Wukong to the top lane. I've been wondering why teams haven't been doing this more. Wukong is definitely playable in the top lane, and I think flex picks are so dangerous. Maybe just top laners don't feel super comfortable playing him into certain matchups that are meta right now, like the Cassante, which I understand, but playing into something like Jace, like, you can do that. It's not going to be particularly easy, but Wukong is still going to be Wukong in late game teamfights, and that's really all that you're asking for. And so, overall, I really do like what BDS was able to do in this one. As for Fnatic on the other side, I don't like what they were able to do in this one. I don't think I'm breaking the bank by saying that this team just has no direction. You know, we were talking about a team like Excel that really lacked a lot of cohesion. That's not necessarily the problem here for Fnatic. Yes, they make a lot of bad decisions, most notably, obviously, after you end up dying level 1, you just have the Lux roaming everywhere. Advienne is just out on the map instead of actually trying to play towards a Caitlyn Lux lane that basically has to win early or else it's going to be completely useless. Like, that's a bad decision, but a lot of the problems that this team is running into is purely mechanical. Like, these players are just not playing well. Advienne is constantly in bad positions. You know, Razork has just not been good in the jungle matchup. He's not been able to exert pressure. Oscar Rinnan can't really hold up against any other top laner in the region. You know, there just aren't a lot of good performances coming out on Fnatic, which is, in my opinion, more concerning because it's less likely that you just suddenly become really good at playing the game than it is you figuring out how to play as a unit. My dud of the game is going to go to Advienne in the support position. Again, the hook at level 1 is bad, but it's certainly not game-ending. What is game-ending is you completely abandoning your AD carry after that point in the game to go out roaming. I get that you want to try and salvage some other lanes because you think bot lane might be lost, but Jinx and Blitz got first tower against a Caitlyn at 10 minutes. Like, that is disaster on the side of Fnatic's bot lane. I thought Advienne was really bad this game. He made some poor decisions. I'm not even sure if it was his call to just leave the lane, but Reckless had to pay the price for it. He really didn't get to play the game in this one. He also didn't hit his support quest until like 15 minutes, and so even though he was walking around the map and he was kind of roaming around, he wasn't establishing vision because he didn't have wards to actually place. Even when he did end up getting his support item and his support quest maxed out, he didn't get red trinket, and so he still had yellow trinket. He was literally just wasting ward spots. Just a lot of weird amateur mistakes coming out from Advienne, who already didn't have a good week 1. I'm high on this player, but I think the pressure of playing on Fnatic, and especially the pressure of what this team has become, is really getting to him, and it's really becoming a problem. Topside is still an issue as well. It's certainly not just bot lane. Oscar Rinnan continues to be run over by basically everybody that he's played against. He doubled his kill total this week, which is good, with 1. So that's a good sign. He now has 2 on the season. Razork was really bad in the jungle matchup, just getting outplayed on the Lee Sin. That's 2 games in a row where it's like Lee Sin just has absolutely no pressure. Even though Humanoid and Reckless, I thought, played relatively fine, the rest of the team was just a disaster, and that's kind of the story of Fnatic, is it's the same players. It's a lot of the new players, and then Razork not being able to control his jungle matchup that have just made this team super anemic against pretty much anybody else in the entire league. I still think that they have a chance to be fine, but again, my prediction of them coming into the bottom 2 at the end of the split looks pretty good right now. As for BDS on the other side, this team has proven that they are top 6 at the very least, especially with a team like Astralis kind of struggling. This could be a top 5 team in the entire league in terms of talent, and I really don't even think that's that far out of the realm of possibility. Them and Koi are probably relatively similar in terms of that. I think Adam can still win basically any game. Crowny and LeBrav are one of the best bot lanes in the league. BDS has a lot going for them, and this game kind of showed that off. And then moving on to our 4th game of day number 1. It's a battle between 2 unbeaten teams heading into week number 2 here. We had Team Vitality taking on SK Gaming. And Vitality is the one to maintain that undefeated record after this one. The 2 3-0 teams coming out of week 1, both of them looking good for basically opposite reasons. Vitality just being ridiculously mechanically talented and being able to go up against basically anybody and just kind of skill check them. They dominated week 1. Upset had a perfect KDA through the first week. That obviously ends in this one with the death on Lucian, but we'll talk about it. He was still pretty freaking good in this one. SK, very much an opposite kind of thing. They are very slow, very methodical in how they like to play the game, and oftentimes their sensational mid-game likes to propel them above a lot of the rest of the teams. I think you could argue that they have some of the most consistent macro of anybody in the LEC, and so 2 kind of conflicting ideologies going up against each other, and it's Vitality's pure skill that comes out on top. They were really good in this game. A lot to talk about, some mistakes overall, and certainly SK doesn't have anything to be ashamed about. Yes, they lost this game, but it was very close, and they definitely tested Vitality. They forced them to make a lot of plays, and unfortunately for them, this is not Vitality from Winter. This is a team that actively is going to, most of the time, make the right decision. I think a lot of that starts with their big change in the quote-unquote off-season, and that's bringing Upset in here to play ADC. He comes in, and he's going to be my player of the game here for Vitality. I know his scoreline isn't exactly as dominant as maybe some other people on the team, but his presence was really felt in this one. The team really needed some sort of aggressive play in the mid-game here, and the Lucian Nami was exactly the kind of pick that I think could really excel here. Now, obviously, if you followed the channel, you'll know I'm not a big fan of Lucian Nami in the meta right now. I think you really do have to be incredibly talented to be able to pilot it over some of the other bot lanes that you're going against in the meta, especially something like Zeri Lulu, where if you make basically one mistake, your game is over. But you know, Upset is that good. He's going to be able to pilot the Lucian really well and actually set Vitality up really nicely here. While the rest of his team was winning, Photon, Perks, Bo, all generating nice leads, they did a pretty bad job of maintaining that in the mid-game. Photon in particular was inting a lot. Perks had some moments where he was just face-tanking a ridiculous amount of damage. Bo was being way too aggressive in certain circumstances. It felt like Upset was kind of the one on the team that had to be the most consistent, that had to keep everybody in check, and luckily for this team, he actually was able to do that, but he was really good here. I think his addition to this team has been absolutely massive. He has been everything we could have asked for, and more for Vitality. I know a concern for me, a quote-unquote concern, because it really wasn't a concern, I talked about that in the video, going into the year was, where is Vitality going to spend its resources? Because you want to play to Upset and Kaiser. You want to play to Perks. You really want to play to Photon. Like, where are you going to spend a lot of your pressure in the early game? And what really it has seemed to, like, boil down to is just wherever they want. Like, instead of it being, you know, one player takes more of a backseat and the other just gets more comfortable, it's just kind of Bo moving around the map, playing for himself, and then just kind of going wherever he feels he has the best chance to make an impact. And I think that makes Vitality maybe the most scary team in the LEC. Obviously, I didn't move them up to number 1 last week, only just because I still think G2 is kind of the team to beat right now, even if their record doesn't exactly show it. But Upset joining this team and clicking as well as he is right now is a big reason why I feel so much confidence in Vitality in general. Bo was also fantastic. They don't win this game without his contributions in the back half. I feel like, honestly, we've lost a lot of hype around Bo. I think the narrative has kind of gone full circle with him, all within the span of like 3 months, where it was like, he's the best jungler of all time, to he's a little bit overrated, to, you know, the group stage rolls around and it's like, he really needs to fix it. He's not even a top 5 jungler. I feel like we've gone to the full extent. We've gone all the way up and then all the way down on the narrative with Bo. He's really good. He's one of the best junglers in the LEC, and it's not really all that debatable. Yes, he's going to have some games where he's not exactly perfect, but for the most part, he is more than positive for this team. I think he's really going to come into his own the more he gets comfortable playing with players like Perks and Upset and Kaiser and, Photon really getting comfortable with the team. And so I'm not really worried at all about Bo. I'm not really worried about Vitality. This team looks fantastic, and I think it is incredibly sustainable for them. As for SK on the other side, certainly not a loss that you're going to hang your head over. You got beat by a really, really talented team, but you put up a real nice fight in this one. There is nothing to be ashamed of here. There were a couple players that I really wanted to point out actually having really good mid-games. Marcoon being the biggest one. I thought Marcoon was actually really good towards the back half of this game, keeping it alive for SK, keeping a lot of these plays going. He was being super aggressive with a lot of these engages, but it was doing really well. It was making Photon and Perks and all these people have to really think about going in. Well, I guess I shouldn't say think because they didn't. They just died anyways. And so Marcoon doing a good job taking advantage of some weaknesses. Obviously, the Elder 50-50 isn't on him. It's just a 50-50. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. But I thought he had a pretty good game. Exakick was solid. I thought DOS was really good towards the back half. Unfortunately for SK, they just didn't have the firepower, and that to me comes down to laning prowess, and that is the reason that I'm giving Irrelevant my dud of the game. I still really like Irrelevant as a player, and I think he's really solid, but he did kind of get run over by Photon in the laning phase, and he was probably the most noticeably down, I should say, on the side of SK after like 10, 15 minutes into the game. Now, he did a good job kind of rebounding in the late game to capitalize on some of Photon's mistakes, but that early deficit he dug himself into was just a little bit too much for him to dig himself out of, in my opinion. I still think he's a solid player, and honestly, he didn't have a miserable game or anything like that. I don't think any of these 10 players had a miserable game, but he was probably the most noticeable to have a bad game. I also thought Certus could have been a little bit more aggressive in the mid-game, try to take advantage of some of these, lower mobility carries. I'm thinking about the Casio, I'm thinking about the Nami, trying to take advantage of them a tad bit more, but, that's just nitpicking. I still think SK did mostly what they were supposed to do in this game. They just were a little bit outmatched. This is a good team, maybe not a team that is going to be like a genuine contender for finals like we kind of thought last week. They're still solid, and obviously this team can still show a lot of improvement. Bot lane's good, jungle's really good, solo lanes have been mostly good, but they still are a little ways away from being in that G2 Vitality category. As for Vitality, on the other hand, yeah, they're in that upper echelon. They are right there. Talent-wise, you can consider them the most talented team in the entire league. This team looks unstoppable when they play their game, when they get to play at their pace. Upset and Kaiser have worked really well together, and Upset has been exactly what this team needs in terms of consistency, because Bo and Perks and Photon are still playing their ridiculously aggressive style that was able to generate them so many leads in the previous series. If they're able to capitalize on those and be a little bit more consistent in the mid to late game, this is going to be a team that is going to be almost impossible to beat. And then moving on to our 5th game of day number 1, the final game of the first day here, and this is the one I was looking forward to maybe second most after the one we just discussed. It was Koi taking on G2. These two teams always play each other tough, and this was certainly no exception, but Koi was actually able to get the upper hand in this one to put themselves back at 500, 2-2 on the season, and you got to talk about top lane. You can talk about how, Shigenda coming in has upset the balance, and clearly because this team wasn't as good as they were last year, that Odoamne leaving and Shigenda coming in was the problem for Koi, but obviously when you look a little bit deeper, it is clear that Shigenda has done some pretty good things for this team, especially so far in spring. This is their second win of the split. I would attribute both of them to Shigenda playing really well, and I don't think that is a bold take to make really at all. That first game they played in week 1 against Heretics, where he played that phenomenal Jace game, was definitely his, and then this one, I mean, what an unstoppable Gnar performance. Really, really dominated Broken Blade in this matchup. It was not a particularly close top lane duel between these two teams, and honestly, it's just huge respect over to Shigenda. He got a lot of shit from the internet, from a lot of critics, from people who were really critical of this team's performance, not necessarily of his individual performance, and then kind of extrapolating it into his individual performance, but I do think he is quieting them very, very quickly here. He was up like 70 CS at like 14 minutes into the game, something like 2k gold by himself, something ludicrous. Like, he dominated this matchup as Gnar into Jax, which isn't some particularly dominant counter pick matchup or anything like that. There really isn't a lot that Gnar should be able to do here to dominate the Jax like this, but he was just so much better. I do hope that this kind of moves the argument and moves the conversation in a direction where we can honestly say that Shigenda is a pretty good top laner. Maybe not like the best in the entire league or anything like that, but he's far from the problem on Koi. He was far from the problem in winter. I was saying that all split long. That was probably my biggest narrative with the team, was that Shigenda's not the problem. We don't need to blame him. And I certainly think he is far from an issue for a team that is genuinely trying to contend for an LEC trophy. I think Koi should be able to get it done so long as he continues to play at a good level. If he continues to play like this, it continues to play like a top laner in the entire league, then that's a completely different story, because if he can do that, then he might be a legitimate, power player for Koi as we get into the more important games. But he was far from the only one. I think Comp and Trimby played well in this game, and I've always said for Koi, especially over the past few months, that's the barometer. If Comp and Trimby play well, if they're able to win their lane, if they're able to generate a strong lead in the mid game, the team probably wins the game. That's what happened in group stage last year, or last split, when they really were able to just kind of take over. Was Comp and Trimby got hot at the right time and they started to win. Larson's consistent. Malrang's going to be finicky. He's going to be a little bit hit or miss, but I think for the most part, he's been able to hit. As long as he plays his style, it's mostly going to be a positive for the team. But if Comp and Trimby can generate that lead, Koi is a very difficult team to take down. It's always just going to be about the consistency when it comes to Koi, and in this one, they showed some good things in that regard. As for G2 on the other side, not exactly the performance you wanted to see. Some of the players did step up. I thought Yike had a good early game. He had a miserable late game, but he was pretty strong in the early part here on the Vi. And then Hans and Mickey weren't like a problem. Ashheimer can be a really disgusting lane to play into. Comp and Trimby did a good job surviving that. Really, the biggest gap that they had, and I already talked about this a bit, was top lane. And that means Dud of the Game's going to go to Broken Blade up there, and there was really no other choice. A lot of people have been really critical of Broken Blade over the course of the split. I totally understand why, if I'm being completely honest. As someone who has been a notorious Broken Blade hater in the past, go back to like my 2019 videos, even 2020, 2021, right? TSM Broken Blade, Schalke Broken Blade. I was very low on him as a player, but he really did turn a new leaf last year in terms of the consistency. He was always someone who could have those big pop-off games, but the consistency with Broken Blade was never there. He would also need a lot of resources in order to get there, and when he didn't get them, he would be a little bit of an issue, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. I think a lot of the mechanical skill just hasn't really translated so far in 2023, and it's honestly a bit concerning. Now, if this was only a couple of weeks old, I wouldn't be as worried about it, but he really has not been able to generate 1v1 top lane leads all year so far, whether it be in winter or in spring. And that's something that this team is desperately going to need him to at least be competent at, because this team is going to MSI. This team is going to be playing international tournaments. Broken Blade needs to be able to hold up against some international top laners. I know people have expressed their concerns about his ability to go up against international top laners. I've mostly been on the side of him in this debate, where I've been like, he'll probably be fine. Maybe he'll give up some games here or there, but he's not going to be this giant hindrance. I think with recent form, it's certainly making me a little bit more concerned. This game in particular, again, being down as Jax 70 CS at 14 minutes is just not acceptable. Like, there is no world in which that is something that you can feel okay about, and that was a big problem this game. Yike definitely ran it down towards the back half. This team's macro kind of fell apart when they were behind, but it really was Broken Blade that put them in that hole to begin with and made it pretty much impossible for them to deal with the Gnar in the late game. And so for G2, your answer to this is just to get a little bit more consistent in the early game. Now, I don't think that's going to be a huge problem for this team. Caps, Hans, Yike, Mickey, they are all ridiculously talented players. You should have a lot of power sides of the map to play to, but Broken Blade is simply going to have to be better if this team is going to want to win as many games as I think they genuinely want to win. And then for Koi on the other side, this team looked good in this game, but again, it's not about one game with Koi. It's never really been about one game with Koi. There have been plenty of one games over the course of this split, this year for Koi, that have looked really good. It's going to be about the consistency. It's going to be about getting them to play like this every single game. If Comp and Trimby can continuously win, even on late game bot laners that can deal a lot of damage in the late game, obviously. And if Shigenda can continue to be legitimately one of the more dangerous top laners in the league like he has been in spring so far, like, Koi is a team that can compete with anybody in the LEC. It's just going to be about bringing out the good version of Koi rather than the bad version of Koi in every single game. And now moving on to day number 2 here. Of course, every single week in the LEC is a super week, so 3 days to cover. The middle day starting off here with a great matchup, one I was really excited for, between Astralis and Team BDS. Really back and forth game here. Both teams definitely bringing some of their best. We'll talk about maybe some of their worst as well, but BDS is the team that is going to come out on top in this one, even being down 2 kills at the end of the game. They had one distinct advantage in this one. It wasn't mechanics, it was macro. They were so much better in terms of their decision making. Honestly, some phenomenal plays coming out from BDS in this one. And if you didn't believe in them before, you better believe in them now. This was a huge win for a team that absolutely needed it. Astralis really has been playing some good League of Legends up until this point this year, and obviously not the best start to their week 2, but we'll kind of talk about their own mistakes and why I think they might be a little bit more fixable than some of the other teams near the bottom of the standings in a little bit. But let's talk about BDS first and foremost, and how they were able to take this one. Well, at the start of this game, it didn't look all that good. Astralis actually got a huge lead in the bot lane. Kabe and Jonghoon with a really nice bounce back game after being pretty poor on day number 1. Good to see that. 113 spending a lot of time and a lot of attention, making sure that that Zeri gets online. You have a hyper carry plus engager versus hyper carry plus engager. What is this, 2020 all over again? I'm all here for it. Do not get me wrong, but certainly not what I expected in this meta. Good to see, and Zeri was definitely the one who kind of got ahead in this case. So you would think Crowny's kind of out of it, right? Like, the Jinx really isn't ahead, not really in a good position. Labrov can't really find any good engages here, and Astralis is looking like they're in a really good position, but then we get to the mid to late game, and that Aatrox just becomes genuinely unkillable on the side of BDS. We're not really seeing a lot of Aatrox right now. His lifesteal, his drain tank ability has really been gutted ever since Worlds last year, where he was the most dominant champion in the entire game. He's really kind of been taken down on a priority list, but I think that has opened up some intriguing builds, and Adam is not shy about pulling out a pick that he feels is really good, even if the rest of the world is not necessarily catching up to it yet. The Aatrox was definitely that in this game, and it's going to earn Adam that player of the game performance. He's been so good over the course of the year, and building full tank Aatrox is honestly a really good idea in the current meta. If you can't drain tank, if you can't sit there and, auto attack and Q to get all your health back, you might as well just tank in general. You might as well build full tank, press ultimate, and be really difficult to kill and really get a lot done doing the things that Aatrox does just generally, and Adam was able to do that here. This is a pick that, fundamentally is incredibly strong. It's always just about numbers when it comes to Aatrox, and even with the numbers low, Adam was still in a good enough position this game to be able to take over. He really is genuinely maybe the most talented top laner in the entire league. I mean, Photon obviously is right there with them, but those two definitely feel like they are in such a different league than any other top laner in the league right now that it's honestly super fun to watch. It really feels like Adam is reaching his potential with us live on stage, not only because of his mechanics. He's always had great mechanics, right? He's always been able to win 1v1 matchups, and he's always been able to generate his own leads. It's just about, what he's been doing with those leads in previous years. It really feels like he has honed in a lot of his mistakes, a lot of the egregious mental errors that he would be making, some of the over-aggressions in early laning phase, and most notably, his late game has improved so much. His ability to take that lead and do something with it in the mid to late game has gotten so much better, highlighted by the fact that BDS made one of the best calls that I've seen all year, which is delaying taking the Elder Dragon. Like, they had it, but they were delaying taking it so that they could sync it up with the Baron fight that they knew was going to be coming. It's a genius idea. Watching Mike Check, that's all Adam's call, and that is a brilliant call for this team. Really impressive stuff. Adam has been fantastic for this team. He has been kind of the cog that makes it go. As good as bot lane has been, without Adam, this team doesn't win nearly as many games, and I think that was shown off. Crowny and Labrov were still good in the late game, but this really was the Adam show, and it was a lot of fun to watch. As for Astralis on the other side, macro was the part that kind of blew them up in this game. This might be one of the worst macro performances in the late game that I've seen from a team, but there are positives to take away. They knew how to get an early lead, which I think is the harder thing to kind of capitalize on, and I'll get to that in a bit. Kabe and Jonghoon were pretty far ahead in this bot lane matchup. 1-1-3 on the Lee Sin, spending a lot of time down in the bot side trying to get Kabe in that position, and he succeeded. The problem was that when they started getting into these team fights, they were taking disadvantaged fights. They were out of position. They were late to objectives. They didn't really have a clear identity of where to put a lot of their, focus and attention in a lot of these fights, and it really came back to bite them. Like, it just wasn't a very good late game. Their mid laner was doing negative damage on the Annie, and that's why Leader is going to be getting my dud of the game here on the Annie. You just can't be doing as little damage as he was doing. A lot of people are going to criticize the build. I do understand why you end up building it, but whatever the reason, it did not end up working out in this game really at all. You needed a lot more coming out from your mid laner, and you just didn't get it. But you could also say you wanted a lot more out of the Zeri that you got super far ahead. Zeri with gold should be absolutely obliterating this team, especially with the kind of lead that Astralis had in this game. but there just was no shot. Aatrox was on the mid line, separating Zeri from the rest of the team, and then from that point onwards, nobody was actually peeling the Zeri off, and so she wasn't able to get any damage out in any of these team fights, and Kabe's lead basically became completely irrelevant. I really do think that, luckily for this team, these are fixable problems, right? It's not mechanics, it's not just your players being worse. That would be a lot more difficult to be able to get right. If your players are just worse, it's kind of hard to win games, but if it's good players making bad decisions, you can teach them what good decisions are. You can teach them to be a little bit more clinical when it comes to, getting objectives, playing smart in the mid to late game, not getting caught out. Those are things that you can pick up, and that's something that Astralis, you really want to hope that they can get better at. This is a team that has already overperformed a lot of expectations. I know they've gone 0-2 to start the week, but this game does give me some hope that at the very least they are going to be competitive with the top 6 teams in the league. As for BDS on the other side, like I already said, this team is legit. There is no more competition. There is no more questioning it. Their mid-game problems have seemed to be a lot better, a lot less this split than they were in winter. That was something they struggled with. It doesn't seem like they struggle nearly as much with it. Adam has improved a lot. Crony and Lebrav are good, even if they don't win early. Sheo and Nuke are more than passable enough to be your weak links. BDS is a genuinely good team. Maybe not a team that's going to be competing with like Vitality and G2, but certainly a team that you have to watch out for no matter who you are. And then moving on to our second game of day number 2 here, and this one was a little surprising for me. Definitely not the outcome that I expected. We had Mad Lions taking on Excel, and Excel picks up the win. This is huge for this team. Obviously, I have kind of been on the Excel bandwagon since the beginning of the year almost. Unfortunately so, when you go back and look at my pre-winter power rankings, but even going into spring, I felt like this team should not be bottom 2. They were not one of the 2 teams that I predicted to be in the bottom 2. That was Fnatic and Heretics, but I thought they were going to be able to kind of play up to some of their quality. Maybe not be like a definitive top, 5, top 6 team or anything like that, but they should have certainly been a lot more consistent, and that's kind of been the case so far. I know we just talked about a loss to Heretics where I was like, maybe pull the plug on this team, right? But this was kind of the conclusion of a growth arc that I think they have absolutely started at this point. A lot of these players are incredibly mechanically talented. We've known that the whole time. It's never really been a problem with individual performances. Yes, some of them have not really been all that great. VTO hasn't stepped up. Xerxes hasn't stepped up. But I don't think that it's ever really been mechanical, right? These players are good enough to be able to play their way out of slumps. It's really always just been about the micro and the macro decisions mentally that this team has been able to make, and being on the same page when they do make those decisions. That's something that this team really hasn't had. And so to see a game like this where they're able to generate a lead early, able to carry that into the mid game, and able to close it out relatively efficiently, it's just a really good sign for this team overall. My player of the game is going to go to Patrick in the bot lane. It really couldn't go to anybody else. When you're online in the League community as much as I am, you hear so much slander on Patrick as a player pretty constantly that honestly it becomes quite tiresome. I know that he hasn't exactly had the success that, his talent level may kind of equate to in the LEC up until this point, but that shouldn't take away from the kind of player that Patrick actually is. Now, what I've called Patrick in the past is a better version of Neon. I think that kind of is the player that you're getting here on Excel, or at least that's what you want to get out of Patrick, where he can be a little wishy-washy in lane, he can be a little bit up and down in the early laning phases, but he is almost always going to be super consistent in late game team fights, and he's almost always going to be a positive for your team when you get to that point in the game. I think his general stock has fallen so much over the course of the year that it feels nice to see him kind of proving that he still deserves to be considered one of the more talented AD carries in Europe, even if the rest of his team isn't quite following up on that. I think the other players on the team did play well in this. Limit had a nice game on the Soraka. That's a champion that really can work, and VTO is like 7-1 against Niski in his LEC career. Something absolutely ludicrous like that, so it's good to see that tradition kind of continue here. I just think overall Excel looked a lot better than they had looked in the previous game. This is kind of the Excel I was really hoping would come out, but honestly, it's kind of at the expense of Mad Lions, who truthfully are starting to concern me. That is not the first game this split that they should have won, that they just weren't able to actually capitalize on. Yes, they were able to win earlier on in the week, but this loss is very concerning. My dud of the game is going to go to Niski in the mid lane on that Orianna. Like I said, he's been kind of stumped by VTO in his LEC career. It's just not really been a profoundly good matchup for him overall, and that definitely carried over into this series alone, and I definitely think it's got to be frustrating for Mad Lions. Niski had been playing so well. I thought he really proved to everybody in the winter split that MVP split that he had in summer of last year was not a fluke. It was not an accident. He really was one of the best players, one of the best mid laners in the LEC. Unfortunately, he's still going to have games like this. Orianna's not really been a pick that this team goes to all that often. We see the Gragas banned out, and that's been huge for Mad Lions, but even things like the Annie, the Vigar are things that they've been able to pick up. It was far just from his own problem this game. Like, he was bad, but he was far from the only person who was bad. I would say everybody on Mad, with maybe the exception of Carzzy, was really, really bad in this game. And when Carzzy is your best player and your most consistent player, that's how you know the team didn't necessarily perform all that well. Good for Carzzy, actually positioning really well in the Zeri and trying to deal as much damage as possible, but it felt like the rest of the team was absolutely against him in this one. Chasey was miserable in the top lane. He went for a bunch of aggressive plays, was able to generate a small lead, but all of that fell apart in the mid game. Elyoya had no pressure on the map. You don't see Maokai all that often anymore, but he can still do a lot of the things that he was doing around Worlds time last year, and then Hylissang's just not very good on Lulu. There really is no other takeaway than that. Hylissang's just not a player that I want to see picking Lulu all that much. Overall, Mad Lions is definitely concerning me. I still think that the team has, top 4, top 3 upside, but for a team that just came off of a finals appearance, they have started incredibly slow and have raised only questions for me moving on into some of the final weeks. I still, again, think that they are more likely to bounce back than not, but I'm going to have to start taking some of their inconsistencies into account. As for Excel on the other side, this is a nice win, 2 and 3, already doubled your win count from last split. That's always a good thing. I think this team should be good enough to stay out of the bottom 2. I'm not exactly sure if this team is going to be good enough to actually compete, but that's what the upcoming games are going to sort out, whether or not this Excel team can reach some potential that maybe a lot of these players have. And then moving on to game number 3 of day number 2 here, and it's a battle of the 2 winless teams coming out of week number 1. We had Fnatic taking on Team Heretics, and you bet your ass Fnatic was finally able to win a game here in their 5th game of the season. They're not going to go 0-5, they stop at 1-4. Big win for them, obviously massive towards the confidence of this team, and just probably a relief for so many of these players, most especially the new players on the team. Oscar and Advienne have to feel so much better after actually being able to pick up a win here in the LEC. This team still is in a spot where they could potentially play their way out of being in the bottom 2. Obviously, the season is so short that all of these games really do matter, and Fnatic picking up a win here was incredibly important towards getting there, but big, big, big win for this team. Let's talk about the players who played well. Pretty much everybody on the team. I would say if you're looking for a weakness in Fnatic, it is certainly the macro in this game, most specifically the late game macro. That was just really bad. You've got a Jax, you've got a Taliyah. You start going for that 1-3-1 because the Jax is super fed and the Taliyah is going to be able to push really fast and also get around the map really quickly, and you're going to be able to pressure, and that is a great idea. Team Heretics really doesn't have a lot of the answers to that, especially with what we'll get to being a very weak Sion. But they kind of abandon it when they just don't get as much as they want as quickly as they want. They kind of just start grouping as 5, and I think that really detracts from where this comp kind of works, in my opinion, but doesn't really matter. They're strong enough to be able to win a lot of the team fights, mostly off the back of this Taliyah and this Xayah dealing a ridiculous amount of damage and just the incredible amount of CC that Nautilus brings, especially adding it with a Vi. There is a reason these champions are still played a lot in pro, even though they have a lot of weaknesses and they don't particularly look good from behind. It's because the amount that they can do from ahead is actually ludicrous. Things like the Nautilus, the Vi, they're ridiculously difficult to deal with. But my player of the game here in game number 3 is going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. Thank God Humanoid had a good game. I've been waiting for this basically all year long. In my opinion, this is Humanoid's best game in 2023, and I don't think it's particularly close. He did a very good job getting ahead early. Yes, it's against the worst mid laner in the LEC, but he did a good job getting ahead early, being able to generate that lead on Taliyah, and then he did exactly what that champion should do, which is move around the map, make sure that Reckless is in a good spot to actually be able to deal damage on the Xayah, make sure that Razork and Oscar are in a good spot to be able to pressure a lot of the objectives in the mid game, most specifically Rift Herald, and then I think Fnatic did a really good job translating that. Again, I really would have liked to see them commit to some side lanes a tad bit more with a super fed Jax and a super fed Taliyah, but at the end of the day, a win is a win, and I can't complain too much for this team kind of abandoning it when it wasn't necessarily working out for them. I think Reckless was good. Advienne had some really good engages on the Nautilus. Oscar was super far ahead, even if he didn't really do all that much in the late game on the Jax, and Razork I thought was a lot more consistent here, but overall, Fnatic is looking much, much better in this performance than anything they were showing up until this point in the regular season. As for Heretics, this is every fear of this team come to life. This is the two players that have not been able to play really at all for this team over the course of this split so far just collapsing, most specifically Evie in the top lane, who just had one of the most reportable games that I've seen in the LEC all year long. Yes, 0-11-5 is a bad scoreline. It's worse when you watch the games. I mean, it is honestly deplorable how down he was. He was super negative in CS. He was super negative in pressure. He was actively continuing to go in, even when obviously wasn't going to accomplish anything by doing it. I understand that deaths on Sion aren't nearly as problematic and nearly as difficult to deal with as maybe deaths on some other champions, but still, I mean, it is just inexcusable, really, for Evie to have a game like this, and he's really been bad this split. I mean, there really is no takeaway that I can't give that isn't the solo lanes have just been atrocious. They have had the worst solo lanes in the league by such a large margin. Evie's not the kind of player that should be playing to that level. We're kind of waiting for him to get back on track, but this is what I was worried about when he was signed by Heretics. We have to remember, yes, Evie is one of the greatest players in LJL history, but 2022 was probably the worst year of his career, and even though that DFM team ended up making Worlds, it was not a clear-cut choice for them to be that team going to Worlds like it had been in years past, and I think Evie was a big reason for that. Coming over, he did rebound a lot of his image in winter, but it seems he's reverted a lot to his summer performance here in spring so far, and that's just not a very good look for Evie. He's going to need to get back to that, consistent form a lot quicker, or else this team is just going to be bottom 2. You cannot play like this in the top lane and be remotely playable. Ruby has also been garbage this split. I'm not breaking any ground by saying that I don't think. I will say going up against a motivated Humanoid is a good sign for Fnatic, but Humanoid's best game of the year came against the worst mid laner in the LEC. What a big surprise. Ruby's going to really need to step it up. Evie's going to really need to step it up. I think Yankos was a little bit more mortal in this game. I still think he was alright on the Jarvan, but Jack actually had some moments on the Zeri, and Mersa had some moments on the Lulu where they were doing okay. They were able to actually fight, but at the end of the day, those solo lanes just lost way too hard. Oscar and Humanoid had way too much pressure, and the rest of the team was just way too strong. Reckless had gotten gold by that point. There was no way you were going to team fight. So for Heretics, you're really just hoping and praying that some of these players bounce back, because as it is right now, it's just not going to be a very good team. As for Fnatic, you still got to keep your head in this. I know it hasn't been the best start to the year, and it certainly hasn't been the best start to this split, but you're not out. This season is not over by any means. You got to continue to keep trying to win games. There is enough talent on this team for there to be like a 3 or 4, win season, and that's going to be enough to keep you out of the bottom 2, most likely. Obviously that's not guaranteed, but if you can win 3 or 4 games, like, that's going to be able to keep you out of bottom 2, and that's what Fnatic has to be looking for here. This is a good start, but it's got to continue in their future series as well. And then moving on to our 4th game of day number 2, and it's another really good one. Two teams that I would consider to be incredibly talented facing off here. They didn't get a chance to in the playoffs, so it's nice to see it now. We get SK Gaming taking on Koi, and Koi picks up the win. Another really big win for a Koi team that struggled a lot in week number 1, but again, I hate to just reiterate a lot of the points that I've been making over the course of the year so far, but the biggest difference between a really strong Koi that can take down almost any team in the LEC and a weak Koi that isn't able to go up against basically anybody else in the region is Comp. If Comp can play well, they win. If Comp doesn't play well, they lose. It really is that simple for Koi. Now, obviously not that simple against teams like G2 and Vitality, but against SK, who is still a pretty good team, that really is the difference maker. And lucky for Koi, Comp had a pretty fantastic one in this game. We will get back to him in a bit because I want to talk about my player of the game in this one, Larson on the Lissandra. Those engages are incredibly crucial when you're playing Lissandra, especially with something like a Lee Sin, Gnar, Kaisa, things that really do have to dive onto the backline. Your CC duration can be absolutely massive in order to allow those champions to kind of fulfill a lot of the roles that they want to play. And so for Larson to play super aggro, to be able to win the lane early against an Azir, and then to just kind of really turn the tides of a lot of these team fights, it was massive for Koi, and in my opinion, easily the biggest impact in the game. I think he was a really easy choice for me to pick for player of the game. There were a couple of other players that I definitely want to give mentions to, but Larson was definitely my pick in the long run. Malrang definitely in that conversation. Comp and Trimby, for as good as they looked in the late game, well, for as good as Comp looked in the late game, they did not have a pretty good early game. I would say Xkick and DOS were definitely dominating that lane phase. Not that that's surprising. Xayah into Kai'Sa is pretty Xayah favored, and so that should have gone that direction. But Malrang did a pretty good job being able to bail them out. A lot of really well-timed ganks towards the middle half of the game to pick up kills on DOS, to pick up kills on Xkick, and then to get Comp into that position where he could start snowballing away on the Kai'Sa. Super important, and then Comp kind of took over from there. The amount of damage that this Kai'Sa can do in the late game, if she has gold, is super impressive. There's a reason that this pick has been rising in popularity in basically every region, and this is the reason, because she can absolutely decimate team comps in the back half of games, especially if your ADC is good. Now, all of my worries about Comp have not been dissuaded. Like, I definitely still have some concerns about him as a player, and most specifically, his consistency in the early laning phase, but as a mid-game team fight monster, like a skirmish monster like he was last year, he can still be that. He can absolutely still be the guy that, you know, finishes the game at 12 minutes from one incredibly successful fight because he snowballs the game out of control. Shigenda was really good here as well. I want to give him a lot of props for just being incredibly solid on the top side. I think you can make a really solid argument. He's maybe been the best top laner in the LEC so far in Spring Split, and I don't know how many people would actually argue that with you. He has been fantastic for this Koi team, and he was great again in this game. I would say the only negative for Koi is Trimby on the Rakan, and you know, some of the gauges were fine. I actually don't think that his Rakan play was particularly awful. What was awful was his face tanking of literally every single thresh hook that was thrown out on the side of DOS. Credit to DOS, he hit almost every single one, but man, Trimby was out of position a lot and was caught out a bit. Luckily, the rest of the team was able to bail him out in certain circumstances, but I think on a worse team, this would have looked a lot worse. Either way, they were able to take the win, and that's really what matters in the long run. As for SK on the other side, it's definitely frustrating to start this week 3-0 and move into the final day at 3-2. Not really exactly how you wanted this to go, and I think a lot of it is explainable at the very least. You played two very good teams, and you actually put up a relatively decent fight, but unfortunately, you weren't able to take it home. My dud of the game is going to go to Certus in the mid lane. Just not a great performance from him on the Azir. He pulled a humanoid in this one, and he ulted the super fed Gnar, not the super fed, but a strong Gnar directly on top of his Xayah to kill her immediately, and then there just wasn't much left to do. There's always that fun little Shuriman Shuffle team kill little interaction that you can do if you want to go for it, but just generally speaking, Certus didn't have a lot of impact. He lost the mid lane matchup to a Lissandra, and then didn't really have any impact in the late game as an Azir. That's just never going to be grounds for a good game. Certus has had some games like this throughout the year. He's going to be a little bit volatile. I think the good still outweighs the bad, but wasn't a particularly inspiring performance from him. I think when you're looking at positives, it's still going to be the bot lane for SK. Xkick was good. Malrang did a great job shutting down Xkick because he actually had a lot of gold in the mid game. Malrang did a great job, you know, targeting him, making sure that he didn't have nearly as easy of a day. And I don't even think he really made all that many mistakes. It was just Koi kind of outplayed him. And then DOS was also phenomenal on this Thresh. I mean, he has been truly terrific over the past couple of weeks, like even dating back into the end of winter. DOS has really emerged as one of the more interesting supports in the entire region, and that's a really fun thing to say. I had very low expectations for him going into the year, as I think a lot of other people did, but he has surpassed basically all of them at this point. He is more than capable of playing at this level, and him and Xkick are definitely one of the best supports in the, or one of the best bot lanes in the entire region. But overall, I think SK was relatively fine this game. Not necessarily their best work, but you know, losing to Koi in a manner like this, like, you're going to kind of be able to live with that. Hopefully, they're going to be able to get back on track as they face maybe some less controversial teams, but you're not going to blame them too much for losing to Vitality and then losing to Koi. Koi, on the other hand, like, this team is legit. They're actually good. They're sitting at 3-2 now. They have responded from a pretty weak week 1 and kind of gotten back into groups form, which I think is a really good sign. Hopefully, they can maintain it. It's always just going to be about maintaining for this team. We know they're talented enough. Again, it's going to be about whether or not Comp can be one of the best AD carries in the league. My money is betting on him being one of the better ones, and I think that will carry over into Koi's success. And then moving on to our final game of day number 2 here, and this was the matchup of the week. For many people, my number 1 and 2 teams in my power rankings going head-to-head. We had Team Vitality taking on G2 Esports, and G2 picks up the win. They confirmed that I was right to not lose faith in them this early on into the season. This is a team that consistently drops games for absolutely no reason against some of the bottom teams in the league. I didn't want to overreact. I didn't want to worry, and they proved me right here with a massive win over Vitality, handing them their first loss of the split. Really nice stuff coming out from G2. Basically, the whole team playing well here. I know some people are going to criticize Broken Blade's performances. We will get to that in a second, but let's go ahead and talk about the positives for G2 first and foremost, because this just was a really good game from them. It's really hard to talk about G2 in this game without talking about the two players that I think have really stood out for them, in my opinion, mechanically speaking, over the course of the year so far. That being Yike in the jungle and Mickey X in the support position. My player of the game is going to go to Mickey on that Soraka. Those silences are so deceptively difficult to deal with, especially on Vitality's team. I mean, look at that. Gragas, Aesol, Zeri, like, that's a problem. Like, being silenced is a little bit of an issue on that team, and Mickey was a huge nuisance with that in team fights. It's not even, you know, accounting for the added value that Soraka just generally gives by being Soraka, right? By giving health in lane, by giving health in team fights, a global health ultimate. Like, Soraka just generally adds so much value to your team comp, and I thought Mickey piloted her at an incredibly high level. He has been the best support in Europe so far this year. Not that many people are really that surprised. Getting him back on the organization that really blew him up in the first place is a really good idea. Some people are going to argue that. Some people are going to say Misfits really did that. It was G2, let's be honest. He was a good support before G2. He was a solid one, but he became the best support in Europe on G2, and it's good to see Yike continue to play really well. Yike versus Bo is actually an incredibly interesting jungle matchup, I think, on paper. I think Yike, someone who I think gets a little bit more attention to detail from his team. His team kind of helps him out a bit more, whereas Bo's kind of left on his own, and that was definitely no more present than in this game. We will get to that in a bit, but Yike with a masterclass on the Vi. Genuinely one of the more impressive jungle performances all year long. If Mickey didn't play as well as he did on the Soraka, Yike would have been a shoo-in for player of the game in 90% of scenarios, but he was awesome. He tracked Bo the entirety of the early game. The Gragas really got nothing done, and he really couldn't get anything done. He had no pressure. He was getting invaded, and then Yike using that information to be able to make a lot of aggressive plays on the map and set his team up for success. This is legitimately a jungle masterclass. This is one of the better performances that I've seen in this role in 2023 in the LEC. Really, really good stuff. If you haven't watched it, I would recommend you go back and just watch like the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game just to kind of see what Yike is doing, how he's tracking Bo, how he's making decisions based on where he knows he's going to go next. Incredibly impressive stuff coming out from the very young G2 jungler, really proving his merit that his first team All-Pro selection in winter was definitely not a fluke here. But Caps, Hans were really good as well. Some people are going to get on Broken Blade because he didn't really lane all that well in this game. Kled into Camille is relatively okay for Kled, and he just kind of lost the early laning phase, but at the end of the day, it's Photon. Photon's really good. I'm not going to criticize Broken Blade too much. I know a lot of people are making memes about how he's going to hold up at international tournaments against teams like T1. I'm still a little bit worried about that in the grand scheme of things, but I wouldn't be surprised if Broken Blade was a little bit better at those tournaments than maybe people gave him credit for. As for Vitality on the other side, not a lot of positives to take away from here. I think the positives are the solo laners. Photon had a good laning phase, even if the Camille really didn't do anything past like 10, 15 minutes into the game. And then Perks, holy, you know what, you want to talk about someone doing something after 10 to 15 minutes into the game. Well, Perks on the Aesol was definitely someone who did something. That champion is so ridiculously strong. I know not a lot of teams are picking him up, but I honestly can't bring myself to understand why. If you get to that point in the game where Aesol is just kind of dominating, I mean, he controls the entire area. The E is the size of the entire lane. You can basically take the entire minion wave as well as deal 19 million damage by pressing the Q button once. It's absolutely absurd how much damage this Aesol does. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Vitality was too far behind at that point to be able to actually come back and play, but that champion's nuts. As for my dead of the game, it's going to go to Bo in the jungle. What a negative game from Bo. I mean, he's going to have some of these. He's had some feast or famine performances. This was a little bit of a famine performance for sure coming out from him. Like I said, was tracked basically the entirety of the early game and so got nothing done before like 10 minutes into the game. And then some of the engages he did go for on the Gragas were just very ill-advised. Not exactly things that I would expect his team to be able to follow up on, if you know what I mean. And so, not a great game from Bo, but he's still ridiculously talented. This is Vitality's first real time stumbling this year, so I'm willing to cut them a little bit of slack, or at least a little bit more than maybe some other teams, but they still are going to have to show that they can rebound from this. Remember, this is a Vitality team that did, you know, start off last split incredibly hot and eventually falter down the stretch. I'm not saying that's going to happen again. This team is a lot more consistent and a lot better, but you know, it's something to keep in mind that especially the top side of the map was not exactly the pinnacle of execution down the stretch last split. As for G2, I was waiting for them to prove to me that they're not the best team in the league, and I'm still waiting for them to prove to me that they're not the best team in the league. Yes, they are losing some games to teams that they should beat. That's G2. That's just what this team does. I'm not concerned about it. Mickey is awesome. Yike is awesome. Caps and Hans are awesome. Broken Blade's not having the best split of his entire life, but he can be a little bit of a weak side in that top lane. G2 outside of that, one lane is pretty much unstoppable. And then moving on to our day number 3, our final day here in the LEC. And we kicked it off with an interesting game. Two teams that I was interested to see go head-to-head until they actually went head-to-head and had the most boring game of the week. We had SK Gaming taking on Excel. And they do play a game. They play a 6-0 game. 6 kills. I think 2 kills at 20 minutes or something like that. Utterly disgusting. SK was able to pick up the win here. They were utterly dominant for a majority of this game. It was really slow, though, because Excel slowed that pace down as much as they possibly could. I don't really get why. I mean, I do get why. You're going into Draven and you're terrified, but stop playing so scared against Draven. Like, you can try and win the game. It is allowed to try and win the game, but whatever. We'll get to Excel in a bit. Let's talk about SK first and foremost. For as slow as this game was, at least they were doing stuff. Like, they had moments on the map where they were trying to make plays. They were taking objectives. They weren't really all that contested. They just kind of gained control very early on from some good laning, some good jungling, and then never really relinquished it. It's not really their fault that Excel never came to any of these objectives and actually tried to fight for them. And so the game ended up being very pacifist-oriented, but by the time there was any sort of fighting, SK had generated such a large lead in this game that, they never really had to look back. And by the time they did get to the part of the game where action was actually happening, then Draven was able to get like a 10 billion gold shutdown on a freaking Lulu or cash in on Lulu because he never died. And so, credit to SK, they knew that they just needed the 1 kill on the Draven to be able to snowball the game out of control. And then they got the 1 kill on Draven to snowball the game out of control. I mean, there were a couple candidates. I think a lot of people are going to give it to Exakick on that Draven for that shutdown, but I think it was really DOS who set up a lot of that play, and I think it was DOS who was setting up a lot of the plays. Soraka is just ridiculously strong at being able to create pressure for your team and not really allow the enemy team to create pressure themselves. I think DOS has generally been really good, and I think Soraka has also generally been really good in the LEC. One of the strongest champions, in my opinion. I think it pairs really well with something like Draven. Draven's one of those picks in the LEC that not only have all of the AD carries had a lot of time playing him in solo queue, and most of them have come up being like Draven one-tricks, but also teams don't really know how to play against Draven at this elo. You have to be aggressive with him. You have to try and get him shut down. You have to try and get him off of his stacks. If you just play super passive like this, eventually he's going to get his gold, and then you can't do anything about it. And so, DOS, Exakick, definitely kind of the focal point of the game, but Certus making some nice plays on the Akali, able to blow up a few people, most notably Xerxes in some of these fights. Marcoon established dominance in that jungle matchup early on, and then never really surrendered it. Objectives were all SK in this game, and then Irrelevant was in the top lane on Jax, and nothing really happened. I mean, it's really hard to analyze this game because it was so slow, and there was so little action. There really is not a lot of plays to analyze. SK really did just take lead early and then start doing the things that you're supposed to do with a lead and not really get any pushback. But that brings us to Excel, who just looked inept in this game. I mean, completely anemic. I have no words for how this team ended up playing this game. It's really hard to blame one particular player. I don't think that there is one particular player that you can blame in this game because it is definitely a team-wide decision to not do anything for 30 minutes, but if I'm going to blame someone, I'm going to blame Xerxes in the jungle because his loss of pressure in the jungle early is what kind of instigated this team to just sit back and not do anything. And, for whatever reason, they thought that was the best case, the best way to go about it. Obviously, I massively disagree, and I think it clearly turned out poorly for them, but Xerxes losing that pressure early on the Wukong and maybe feeling like he can't actually contest a lot of this aggression coming out from the Sejuani, I think definitely instigated a lot of their passiveness, I guess you could say. I think you could give this to Patrick and Limit, who just didn't do anything. Again, on the Zeri, you simply have to get gold at some point to be able to team fight against a Draven, and they played super passive, and Limit, at the end of the day, was the kill that ended up giving Draven all of his gold. I don't think you can blame VTO and Otoamne. They were just kind of there. I would have liked to see a little bit more of, the shove and roam style, maybe a little bit more macro coming out from VTO, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to blame him for his team having zero pressure. Whoever is making the calls is at fault here. I don't know who that is. I'm not blaming Xerxes for not making the calls. He was just the most outwardly problematic, but God, this team's macro is just abysmally bad, and it's abysmally passive. And I don't know which one is worse. Honestly, I'm scared for this Excel team. I was getting excited talent-wise. They still do look like a team that probably shouldn't be bottom 2, but this is one of those performances that I am going to beg to forget. As for SK, congrats. You got a win here. You know, it wasn't really your doing. You didn't really have to do a whole lot. I'm not blaming them for the game being super slow, although certainly they were a part of it, but this was not getting contested at all from the enemy team, and then eventually just having enough gold to be able to end the game. Congrats. You know, good for SK. Not really a lot of takeaways from this one, but at least they were able to pick up the win. And then moving on to our second game of day number 3 here, and it's another little bit of an upset. Maybe not so much in terms of record, but in terms of perception, definitely. We had Mad Lions taking on Team Heretics, and Heretics picking up their second win of the season here over Mad, who continues to really struggle, who continues to have problems actually dealing with teams that are below them in the standings. This is a team that just came off of a finals appearance, and now it's looking like they might not even be a top 6 team in the league. I mean, it is certainly up for debate right now. A very poor start, to say the very least, about what Mad is going through right now. But this game's not really about Mad. This game's about Heretics. So let's go ahead and talk about what they did right. First and foremost, it really is just the case with Heretics. Solo laners step up, they're probably going to win. They have enough talent on this team to be able to deal damage outside of them, that when Evie and Ruby have as good of a game as they had in this one, this team's in a pretty good spot, and they had a really, really good game. Honestly, it was very difficult to decide between the two for player of the game. They were the two I was really considering. I think Broadcast gave it to Jack Spectra. I think a lot of people on the internet are going to give it to Yankos, but for me, I was deciding between Evie and Ruby. I think they had the biggest actual impacts on the game. I ended up giving it to Evie in the top lane for that Baron play on the Gwen. Incredibly impressive stuff coming out from Heretics just in general, not only in the early laning phase, but most specifically in the team fights. Incredible team fighting coming out from a team that honestly has struggled with that a bit over the course of the season. They haven't exactly been the most mechanically talented towards the back half of games. Now, obviously, oftentimes they're going into that kind of part of the game with a little bit of a deficit, and so it can be a little bit more difficult to keep pace with some of the other teams that they're playing against, but this was a really good example of what this team is actually capable of when they are playing at a high level. So let's talk about it. Evie getting player of the game on the Gwen. So nice to see Evie actually performing well. I've been super critical of him over the beginning part of the split, rightfully so, because he has probably been the worst top laner in the LEC through the first 5 games of the season. Luckily, game number 6, that's a step up for Evie. I hope he can get back on the right track. He was pretty good, in my opinion, in Winter. Certainly not someone that you can just overlook. And so to see him have another good game here is solid. Ruby having a really good game on the Ahri. This is easily his best game since week 1, day 1 of Winter Split when he pulled out that Cassiopeia and did really well. Outside of that, he really has not had a good game in the LEC that wasn't this one. So really good to see Ruby stepping up. A lot of people are really high on the Ahri build that he went this game. I think it's a good call. I think generally speaking, as long as you're going Everfrost with no CC in the top lane, then I don't really care what you build after that. You know, that item's core to you, and so I get it. But Ruby dealing a lot of damage and generally exerting a lot of pressure in this game. Yankos doing a good job on Vi. Jack Spectra doing a ridiculous amount in those final team fights on Kai'Sa. But up until that point, I would say he wasn't really creating a lot for himself. That's not a problem. Jack's role on this team is not to create for himself. It's to capitalize on what others create for him. And luckily, he did a fantastic job of doing that. I think he's going to get a lot of hate. I think him and Mersa in particular, get a ludicrous amount of hate on this team comparatively to, I think, what their performances actually are. I don't think they are, like, by far the worst bot lane in the LEC. I do think that Jack is probably the worst AD carry. I don't think that Mersa is the worst support. He has absolutely gained the reputation of being so, and I think it is completely unearned. I think watching these games, the amount of plays that he makes, especially on champions who can be proactive, is incredibly positive for the team. And in my opinion, he's probably been the second best player on this team over the course of the split so far. I know a lot of people don't agree with that opinion, and so I guess it's a little bit of a hot take, but I think Mersa's been fine. I think Jack has been far from the problem on Heretics in spring so far. I really think it's been the solo laners, and luckily for them, they actually did step up in this one. As for the other side, for Mad Lions, I mean, disaster. Ending the first 2 weeks at 2-4, I mean, that's not what you want to see at all from a team that just finished in the top 2. There are many things that you could diagnose as the problem for this team. My dud of the game is going to go to Elyoya in the jungle. He lost pressure super early on Wukong. And honestly, like, the most accurate way I can describe how he played this game was, it looked like after 10 minutes, he just completely mental boomed. Like, it looked like he was forcing plays. It looked like he was actively just hoping and praying that something he did was going to go right. And And, you know, when you make plays like that in the LEC, especially against a player like Jankos, you're going to get punished for it. And he got punished a lot this game. Not really a positive game overall for Elyoya. And if I'm being honest, not a particularly positive start to the split for Elyoya. I thought he was awesome in winter, especially in the playoffs for this team, but it is not translated over into the regular season in spring so far. I think Killisang continues to not be particularly good. Niski had another bad game in a row, this time into Ruby, which is significantly more concerning than VTO. I don't really know. You're kind of hoping Elyoya and Niski can get back on track because this is probably the worst that they've played as a duo, and that is including in the playoffs last year in 2022 when everybody was saying that this team couldn't buy a game, and so I'm concerned. I'm going to be honest, I'm pretty concerned about Mad Lions. I don't exactly know where this team is headed right now, but wherever it is, they have to figure it out quick. I don't think that they're going to be in too much danger of bottom two, so long as they completely shit the bed in the final week of the season, but they're in position to be in that spot right now. I mean, they're tied with Heretics in the bottom of the standings, and that's not a good look for this team. They really are going to have to step things up quickly in order to get anywhere close to where they want to be, which is top 4, but even right now, hopefully into top 8. As for Heretics, this gets you in a much better spot. I'm still not entirely sold on this team. It feels like they capitalize a lot on enemies' mistakes rather than creating their own advantages, but this was their best game of the split, and it wasn't particularly close. If they play like this in the last week of the season, they will make top 8, but I don't know if I can count on that. Again, I just need to see it more than in one game. I believe in Jankos. I think Jack and Mursa are fine, but they're not carries, and I gotta see it out of Evie and Ruby. This was a great showing, but it is one game after all, and I'm gonna need to see it in 3 more. Moving on to our third game of day number 3 now, and it's another game that I would consider a little bit of an upset. A lot of those in day number 3, as you can already see, but let's talk about it. It's Team Vitality taking on Astralis, and Astralis picks up another massive win. Astralis has 3 wins on the season. They are against G2, Vitality, and Koi. That's the split that Astralis has had so far. A wild sentence to say out loud. The team is sitting at 500 after 6 games, but they have looked so much better than that with the quality of opponents that they have been able to take down, culminating now in a win over a Vitality team that was looking unbeatable up until their loss to G2 just a day ago, but clearly some of the wheels are starting to fall off, and it's culprits that might be a little bit expected. So we'll talk about them in a bit, but we'll talk about Astralis here. First, I really want to give a lot of props to 113 in the jungle. I've been pretty critical of him, not like ridiculously critical. I said in my pre-spring player rankings video that while I still do grade him as the worst ranking jungler in the league, he will likely not perform like the worst jungler in the league, mostly just because I don't know which jungler is going to fall below him, but one of them is going to underperform, and, you know, 113 has kind of surpassed a lot of my expectations. I thought he was just going to be kind of lost at this level, but he's been generally fine. Now, I'm not going to say that he's like a ridiculous positive for the team, but performances like this show that he is an LEC caliber jungler, and that he definitely at least deserved the opportunity to play for a team like Astralis, and you know what? He's making the most of it. Player of the game coming in here against Bo. Obviously, we'll talk about him in just a second. He's got his own problems that he's got to deal with, but 113 on the other side of this matchup, just really, really good play, really consistent play coming out of the Viego. That was his big pick down in the ERLs, down in the LFL, was that Viego. That was something that K-Corp pulled out a ridiculous amount last year in order to make him feel comfortable, and it's good to see him be able to keep bringing that out on the LEC stage. One of my big concerns going into the year was whether his champ pool was going to be flexible. I think he has shown enough flexibility with the things that he's been able to pull out in the LEC over the course of the last 2 splits that going back to a Viego pick in a game that is super important against Vitality is totally fine by me. I'm not worried about him being able to perform on the rest. He's been fine on the rest, but this pick, he is actually sensational, both in the early and in the late game, which is not typical for Viegos. Usually that champion is going to be strong late game. You know, he's going to be able to take over team fights, but he's not necessarily going to have the same kind of pressure early, especially into something like Vi, but 113 I think plays him very well. A lot of credit to Leader as well on this Aurelion Soul. I'm kind of middle of the ground on Leader. I think a lot of people are very high on him, and obviously I think he has improved this Astralis team. Dior was a major black hole for this team in the mid lane. As much as I like his upside, his current ability just wasn't quite there. I think Leader raises the floor of this team by quite a lot, even if he's going to have some bad games, and like I said earlier, Aesol is one of those picks that is just incredibly strong, especially in the hands of a mid laner who knows what they are doing with the pick. And so 113 leader, good to see them get on the same page and good to see them both have good games. Most notably, quite frankly, good to see Astralis be able to win against a good team without Kabe and Jonghoon having to carry the team in the mid game. That's kind of the trope that this team has fallen into over the last few games, and so really good to see this team be able to rely on their jungle mid much more than they were able to last split. They had the worst jungle mid in the entire league last split, especially in the regular season. It's good to see that that is definitely upgraded, but on the side of Vitality, bad. No bueno. Going from 4-0 to 4-2 isn't exactly what you're looking for. I'm not slamming the panic button, but the cover on the panic button has been opened. I am getting ready to press it. Week 3 is going to be absolutely massive for this team because some of the inconsistencies that I was worried about have already started coming out. Most notably Bo in the jungle. He is just such a feast or famine player, a feast or famine jungler that some of these performances are not going to be all that good. Unfortunately, he strung a lot of those bad performances together this week. He has not been good for Vitality over the course of this week, and obviously we know that can happen, but I was really hoping that with time, with a little bit more, preparation, a little bit more time to play with players like Perks and Kaiser and, kind of get the dynamics together, that he was going to stop inting in the mid game, that he was going to stop at least aggressively doing it, being as bad as he was, but this game showed that that is definitely not out of his system yet. I mean, just going in at every single opportunity with Vi, whether or not it's a good idea, is terrifying for Bo. Hopefully he's able to get a lot of it out of his system, because this game was incredibly scary and it was not good. Easy choice for dead of the game. I do want to give credit to Photon. Photon was really, really good in this game. There was only so much that he could do, but the amount of damage he was putting out on the Gwen, there's a reason a lot of people consider this his signature pick. It's because when he gets it, he really does pop off a lot on it, and he showed why he is still, in my opinion, the most talented top laner in the region. Unfortunately, Bo was a little bit too heavy to carry. Perks wasn't able to do a lot. Upset and Kaiser weren't able to get into the backline and actually deal damage, and the Viego was a massive issue in these team fights. Follow that up with Aurelion soul damage, and Annie stuns, and Varus stuns and damage, and a Scion tanking your damage. Like, it's just very difficult to bust through Astralis when you are playing from behind, I should say, and Bo definitely put them in that negative spot. Vitality's got a lot to answer to in the final week of the season. There's really no other way to look at it. I hope that this team can figure out what the hell is going on and kind of rebound and be better, but if the wheels start to fall off of this team again, you're going to have to start taking it as a pattern. As for Astralis on the other side, it is a good regular season for them. Again, I don't know what the ceiling for this team is. I'm still a little bit worried about what's going to happen when teams actually start respecting their gameplay, but 113 has improved a lot. Leader has made this team better. Kabe and Jonghoon were already good. And Finn is very feast or famine in the top lane. He can have some really good games. Astralis is not a team that you can just forget about and kind of run through. They are an actual threat, which is significantly better than the talent level they have at their disposal. Great job by this org to maximize every player on the team. Moving on to our fourth game of day number 3 now, and it's another very intriguing matchup. Two teams I was really excited to see go head-to-head because they always seem to play each other tough. This one, no exception. We had Team BDS taking on G2 Esports, and G2 picks up the win. They stopped the chance at a BDS 3-0 week, which would have been absolutely phenomenal, but this game was incredibly close. Honestly, BDS had this in the bag. They actually had a relatively good early game, and they just weren't able to capitalize on it. They went a little bit too aggro on the Soul Dragon fight, and just ended up giving away a lot of the gold lead that they had over to G2, and they ended up capitalizing because G2, once they gain a lead, is not ever going to look back. Very, very fun game, though. Let's talk about it from G2's perspective. Player of the game was actually kind of tough because I think each player had moments in the game where they struggled just a tad bit, but I also think they had moments where they looked really good. But I think the most consistent player over the course of the entire game for me was Yike in the jungle. I've been very complimentary of Yike as a player. I think this team plays around him really well. Caps in particular does a lot to make sure that Yike is super comfortable in that jungle spot. And I think that really has come out in the spring split. I think a lot of the confidence that they were able to build with him over the course of winter has definitely manifested itself in him really just feeling good enough to be able to make a lot of these really good plays in the late game. And, Vi's one of those champions that I think is kind of difficult to execute at a high level. Again, that's kind of weird to say because she doesn't really have any big mechanical ceiling, but I think it's a lot of mental positioning when it comes to Vi, knowing when to go in, knowing where you need to generate your lead, and knowing exactly how you need to be able to play the early game, because I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Vi needs to be able to generate gold in the early game to be relevant in the late game, or else she is just going to get blown up immediately when she ults onto the backliner. And so big credit to Yike for being able to know exactly how he wanted to play the game. They wanted to play towards top lane in this. They wanted to try and take advantage of some of the aggressive positioning that Adam goes for, especially on picks like the Renekton, and it did kind of work. They were able to pick him off every once in a while, but you know, Yike, I think, did a really good job in the mid game as well of being able to transition that, of being able to keep the lead that BDS was able to generate to a minimum. I think he did a really good job with that. Other players that you want to shout out, Broken Blade, but he did receive a lot of attention in this game. Either way, he still, I thought, played it really well and didn't really make any mistakes, which is definitely an improvement. I think Caps, again, did a really good job enabling Yike in particular. Hans and Mickey got destroyed in the early lane. Really fun of them to see the Twitch come out. Twitch is one of those picks that I think is super dangerous in the right hands. Obviously, if he gets going, I mean, he gets really going, but you can really shut down Twitch. And honestly, it was looking like this was going to be a pretty bad Twitch game coming out from G2 because BDS, their bot lane dominated this matchup early. The Zeri had so much pressure. Hans was 0-4 at like 20 minutes into the game, and then poof, Dragon fight, I'm now 7-4. Uh-oh, now I'm strong. Like, it was really funny how that ended up happening. Han's score ends up looking good. Mickey's score ends up looking good. But I think both of them were pretty big hindrances for this team at the beginning of the game. They didn't really receive a lot of support from their team either, and so it's kind of hard to bury them. But overall, I would say G2 just generally looking fine. They're sitting at 4-2, which I think is respectable for this team at this point. They're going to finish somewhere between like 2nd and 4th in the regular season like they always do, and then just win the playoffs anyways, because that's what G2 does. That's G2. If they finish in first place, that's when I'll start to be concerned, because that's not the G2 I know and love. As for BDS on the other side, really good week that you just weren't able to cap off with a finish here against G2, but overall, you still were pretty competitive against the best team in Europe right now, and that's a very good sign. Dud of the game was really difficult because I don't think anybody was particularly bad, but Adam had to receive a ridiculous amount of pressure in this game, and he did okay with it. But I think if he was a little bit more passive with some of his plays, if he kind of allowed his jungler and Sheo to be able to counter gank a lot of what was going on in the top lane for G2, I think it could have gone just a tad bit better. So Adam's going to get my dud of the game, even though I still really, really love him as a player in the top lane. Still think he is incredibly good for this team. I just think the Renekton could have taken a little bit of a step back, and maybe you would have been in a slightly better position. But keyword there is slightly, because BDS still had to play the mid game, and I think they just got a little bit over-eager, going for that Dragon Soul, feeling like if they get that, then the game is immediately over. They over-invest into that fight. They end up giving over way too much onto the Twitch, and they end up losing that, giving over gold, and not being able to come back in that game. It's super unfortunate that one greedy play, one small mistake ends up costing them, but that really did feel like it. Now, obviously, it wasn't the one play. There were a bunch of plays leading up to that moment that they probably could have done better, but for the most part, they were super in this game, and they very much could have walked away with a win. This solidifies it. BDS is a strong team. I think top 5, maybe top 6 in the LEC right now are very dangerous, very strong teams that can all take games off of each other if things go right, and it very much feels like BDS is in that top 5. I think they proved that not only over the course of the week, but even in this loss here. They were competitive, they knew how to play the early game, they just were not able to close it out against a very solid G2 team. On the other side, G2 is just really, really good. A lot of this is practice for them, but it's cool to see Hans and Mickey pull out something like the Twitch, try to see if they can make it work. Didn't necessarily play to it like I think they wanted to, or maybe like I think they should have, but at the end of the day, at least Hans was able to kind of pick up some kills, and it really did show off the power of that champion if he does get the ball rolling in the late game. If, you know, you maybe get a little bit more pressure in the bot lane, a little bit better execution, that could be something dangerous, but overall, G2 just feels like they're playing with their food at this point in the season, just trying to see what sticks. And then moving into our final game of the week here, our final game of day number 3 and our 15th game overall, we had Fnatic taking on Koi. And of course, Fnatic is able to pick up the win here, their second of the split, because day 3 has been an absolute menace so far to pretty much every top team, and that includes Koi in this instance. Huge win for Fnatic. Continuing tradition, this Fnatic team has always done well against Rogue in the regular season, and that is certainly not changing here, but man, there's just a lot of good to talk about for Fnatic in this game. Not a lot of good to talk about on the side of Koi. We will get to that in a bit, but again, let's start with Fnatic, because congratulations to this team. They're able to pick up their second win of the split. I did not see this one coming. Even I saw, like, maybe Heretics could pick up a win today, because that would be wild, and, Heretics is one of those teams that's a little bit hit or miss. It felt like everything was going wrong for Fnatic at the time, but they are able to pull out this big one, and a lot of it is Razork in the jungle having easily, in my opinion, no question, the single best game that he has had in 2023. I don't even think it is remotely close. What a masterclass coming out in the jungle from Razork on a champion in Vi that has not been a major pick for Fnatic over the course of the year. Not been positive at all for them, and it's very feast or famine. It's certainly not something I would advise this team pick, but Razork played it at an incredibly high level. Malrang went for some cheese early on in the game on the Lee Sin. It did not work out, and Razork punished it very heavily, and from that point onwards, he owned the map. I mean, he completely controlled the pace of the game. He completely controlled how the enemy team was playing the game, how his own team was playing the game. Just an incredibly impressive performance coming out from a jungler that I was really excited to see actually play well. Humanoid had a really good game earlier in the week. Razork has a good game now. My mind is being blown. This is fantastic. Other players to shout out, Advien, what an awesome game on the Nautilus for him. I know that a lot of people said coming into the year that he was an engage-only player, and while that is definitely my evaluation of him as a player, I certainly am not going to disagree with that. I think it is worth noting he's not nearly as bad on enchanters as people like to say that he is. It is good for this team to feel comfortable enough to play something like Xayah Nautilus, though. Reckless feeling very comfortable on the Xayah. That's been by far his #1 pick ever since he has come back, and then the Nautilus is just great for Advien. It allows him to be a little bit more aggressive in the early laning phase, but still roam around the map, because that's what he likes to do. For as good as, Fnatic is at playing their lanes, right, which they're not very good at, but they were good at in this game. Advien's biggest strength, and I talked about this in my preseason predictions, or my pre-split spring predictions, Advien's biggest strength is roaming. That's what he was really good on with Excel. Him and Marcoon had phenomenal synergy, that's why they came up together, and I think that is really what is going to separate Fnatic. If Razork and Advien can get on the same page, it can continue to kind of dominate the mid game, and can dominate map pressure, allow Humanoid to play a lot more aggressive, even allow Reckless to play a lot more aggressive in the bot lane as well. I really do think that that's the best version of Fnatic that we are going to get, and that's kind of what we saw in this game. Razork, Advien was awesome, Humanoid was great, Oscarinin lost tower early, but it didn't matter. The Gangplank was doing a good amount of damage. This is a good champion for him. It doesn't really require him to be all that proficient in the early game, which has definitely shown to be a weakness for him, and he can be aggressive in the late game. He doesn't have to sit around and kind of wait for the rest of his team to do a lot of things, and so I like this comp for Fnatic. I like the way they executed on it. Overall, just a lot of positives coming out from this team. As for Koi, definitely a disappointing loss. Not what you really wanted to see at all from a team that was actually looking awesome up until this point this week. If they were able to win this game, I would have been walking out calling Koi definitively a top 3, maybe even top 2, depending on how you feel about Vitality, team in the entire league. They looked that good up until this point this week, but this was a disaster for this team. Losing this is not good, and it felt like a lot of it was on a ridiculously cheesy level 1 play from Malrang. It does not go their way. Malrang gets set so far behind that he doesn't even get to play the game. He's going to get my dud of the game here, and then what is the rest of the team supposed to do? I mean, Razork owns the map. Advien's moving around the map. They have zero pressure. The only way that they end up winning this game after basically level 3 is if Fnatic completely screws up. And luckily, for Fnatic, they didn't do that in this one. So definitely frustrating with Koi, but I don't know how repeatable this game is for them. And that's a good thing for them overall. I think Comp played relatively fine. His positioning was good. Everybody else just was irrelevant. Trimby didn't have any pressure on Taric. Larson, what is he going to do on Twisted Fate? Stop picking Twisted Fate. The champion's ass right now. And then Gnar in the top lane, whatever, man. You were able to take tower, but outside of that, you exerted zero pressure. They basically gave up on top lane, Fnatic that is. And so, for Koi, as bad as this game was, again, I don't know if it's entirely repeatable, which should be some consolation prize in your heart. This was a horrible start to the game from Malrang, which is concerning because he does have these every once in a while. Sometimes he just bets the game on the early game, and then once he gets behind, he has absolutely no idea how to play. But, assuming that he doesn't do this again, this team, probably still wins 7 or 8 out of 10 against Fnatic, in my opinion. So even though this was a nice win for Fnatic and, a pretty bad loss for Koi, I'm not going to freak out too much over it. But for Fnatic on the other side, what really inspires me about this is the post-game faces from a lot of the players. Advian immediately stepping up and congratulating teammates. Everybody's smiling, and it feels like that's kind of been the way that Fnatic has operated even in their losses. It feels like the atmosphere and the morale surrounding this team has basically completely changed from last split to this split. I'm not sure if it's just the new players added or if players are a little bit more comfortable with not being perfect this split. Maybe the expectations are lower, but whatever it is, it's been a major positive in the direction of Fnatic, and I think that positive morale is going to help their case to push forward to not be bottom 2 this split. All right, that is going to do it for my LEC Week 2 overview and analysis of all 15 games across all 3 days. Up on your screen right now, you're going to see the updated LEC standings after week number 2. Of course, all teams will just be sorted by record, but any ties will be broken alphabetically. That's a lot of ties. You know, first is a 4-way tie, 7th is a 4-way tie. A lot of, tied records right now. The LEC standings are ridiculously close, and it's fun to talk about. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. Let's go over some of the risers and the fallers. Top 2 is going to stay the same. I know some people might want to see Vitality drop. I think that they are definitely a candidate to drop, especially if they have a really bad week number 3, but until they really start showing that they are not capable of going up against some of the top teams in the league, I'm not just going to pretend that is going to happen. Again, concerning stuff in the final day of the week especially, but one game is not enough for me to plummet them down the rankings. I think they will probably bounce back pretty well in week number 3. Other changes, Koi massively jumping up to number 3 in my power rankings. I definitely overreacted, putting them down to number 7 last week. This is still a really good team, and even with the loss to Fnatic, I think they will probably still be able to get their shit together. I know their record isn't in that upper echelon, but they're still an incredibly talented team. Coming in at number 4 is SK, dropping down after the loss to Koi. They're still solid. I still think of them very similarly. I think I just think of Koi a little bit better. And then BDS at 5, Astralis at 6, kind of round out your top 5 and 6. BDS picking up the win feels pretty good there, and just generally speaking, I think BDS feels more consistent as a team, whereas Astralis I do think has some high highs, but may not necessarily be as I might not be as comfortable with them as I am with BDS right now. That means falling to number 7 is Mad Lions, all the way down from number 4. They started the split at number 3. They've just only plummeted down. This team has not been good over the course of this split so far. I feel like I'm being generous giving them the number 7 after what their week 2 showed, but I have a feeling they should at least be this. I would expect them to be able to climb back into the top 6. I just don't know which one of the teams above them is going to be the one to fall out. And then bottom 3 stay unchanged. They were all kind of up and down this week. Some people are going to want to see Excel go down, maybe Fnatic go up, but I feel like that's recency bias towards the final games. I think when you look at the overall split and the exact games that they have played, Excel has had just as many good games as Fnatic has. Fnatic just had them back-to-back, and so I don't really know how to rank these guys. I think week 3 is going to give me a lot of clarity when it comes to how these teams play, but I would expect at least 1, probably 2 of those bottom 3 teams to be the 2 teams that don't end up qualifying. I just don't know which 2 those are just yet, so I don't know how to order them, but that's going to be my power rankings. Let's go ahead and jump into my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 2. My player of the week in week 2 of the LEC is going to go to Yike on G2. I thought he was really, really good in the jungle this week, being able to control pressure, being able to track the enemy jungler, and then being aggressive and quick with his decision making. He looks like an elite level jungler, like maybe the best jungler in Europe, and that's just so unfair for G2 to be able to have. Obviously, the talent around him is making him look better, but the amount of talent that he has is being pulled out by the rest of this team. It's not being manufactured. He is an incredibly talented player that is just being assisted by his incredibly talented teammates. And so Yike is going to get my player of the week here in week number 2. And my dud of the week is going to go to Bo on Team Vitality. A pretty frustrating end of the week for Vitality, and a lot of it was just their jungler not being able to perform. If he continues to be a problem for this team, I don't really know what to tell you. Vitality's going to continue to fall down the standings, and if Bo is right, if Bo's playing well, if those aggressive plays are going well, and if he's synced up with the rest of his team, Vitality is nearly unbeatable. He is an incredibly integral piece to how they like to operate in their system, and if he's, on, then it's great. If he's off, then it's a problem. So Bo is going to be my dud of the week in week number 2, and Yike is going to be my player of the week in week number 2, but That's gonna do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below and leave a like on this video. It lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content and it helps get this out to more people. One thing I do want to point out, we've got a hell of a schedule coming up. If you are new to the channel, I'm gonna be posting for the next 33 straight days because of playoffs. The schedule gets completely jam-packed here. We've already started that. I think we're about 10 days into our 33-day challenge, but if you are looking for LoL Esports coverage, this is the freaking channel for it. It's going to be every day, rocking and rolling, you know, in-depth analysis. So if this is the kind of stuff you really enjoy, I highly recommend you hit that subscribe button so that you can get access to these videos faster. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.